Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. So the Emergencies Act came and then it went. Mandates like vaccine mandates and some mask mandates came and now they're slowly lifting. But what is the state of our civil liberties after all of this tumult, especially with the Emergencies Act? Some Canadians had their assets seized and frozen. Some Canadians are sitting in jail because they partook in a convoy protest. What is the health of our democracy after all of this? Well, joining me to share his insight is Bruce Pardee, Director of Rights Probe and Professor of Law at Queen's University. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for having me.
You know, it's been several weeks now since the Emergencies Act was lifted, but I and perhaps many Canadians still can't get over the shock and, can I say, horror that we were even in a situation where something like that was implemented. Unpack this for me. How did we get to that point?
Right. Well, this moment showed the ugly face of Canadian political life, I think, and also perhaps represents the moment of the end of the Canadian consensus on COVID and on other larger things. I mean, Canada is an obedient country, and it looked like for a long time, like most of the country was on the same page with respect to COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates and government direction of society. And in this moment, the truckers basically said, actually, no, we don't agree. And a lot of other people who I think were mostly silenced during this period discovered that they weren't alone in what they thought. And so one of the consequences of this, I think, and I hope, is that we now have polarization. We have polarization over some very important questions and ideas. And that's not a bad thing in a country that pretends to be free and pretends to be a democracy.
That's a very good point. Often we hear that American politics is so divisive, so polarizing. And one has to step back and say, well, is that actually a bad thing? I personally think that's great. Let there be debate, let there be discussion. That's how I think great policy is hammered out. When you have, all sides come together, debate the heck out of something, and then, good legislation hopefully will come forward without force, without coercion. And that's the sign of a healthy democracy. Debate is a good thing. It's okay to have different opinions. We don't have to be we don't have to have consensus on everything all the time.
Exactly so. Exactly so. The idea of civilized society, I think, is not to avoid conflict, but to avoid violence. If you can have conflict without violence, if you have a dialogue and try to work out your problems on big questions, then that's the objective. But as you say, it's also healthy to have opinions that are on either ends of a wide spectrum, because that's the nature of the polity, right? And it is not necessary to agree with people that you vehemently disagree with, because that's false. And in this country, we've been missing that, I think, for this period. It's great that people found the truckers, saw what they were doing, came to protest, danced in the streets, and even those that didn't come saw what was going on, cheered them, at highway overpasses, and found out that we are, in fact, a split country. And as you say, I think that's a great thing.
So when I think of the long-term effects during this past 2 years with all these, with the COVID and everything, and I'm not talking about long COVID, I'm talking about societal relations, social relations. In my opinion, one devastation has been the breakdown within family relationships, where one would be pitted pro or against the COVID jab, that sort of thing. But you do bring up a very good point in that, well, one of the positives, and I never think about it, I'm a doom and gloom thinker, so I appreciate the sunny ways from Bruce Pardee. But one positive is that, people have found their voice, and they could stand up on an issue that they felt was important, and that we can have this dialogue and things can change.
Yes. So one of the unfortunate characteristics that we carry around is that we're so agreeable. We're supposed to agree. We don't like conflict as a country. And that's not a healthy place to be. Giving these people a voice and legitimacy and expressing that voice to people who are close to them, to family members and friends, is very, very important. And perhaps now we can have an open debate, because up until now, We've been subject to, claims of, misinformation and being extreme. After all, the prime minister called the truckers a fringe minority with unacceptable views, and that's exactly the opposite to what we want.
Welcome back. We're having our discussion with Professor Bruce Pardee. He's a professor of law at Queen's University and also director of Rights Probe. Bruce, we were sort of touching the edges of the Emergencies Act, but I kind of want to really delve in now. The truckers descend into Ottawa, and yes, at some of the border locations in Canada, but they were primarily focused in Ottawa. I didn't see a lot of violence. I don't know if I saw any violence. I know friends who went and partook in the protest. They said there was bouncy castles, smiley times, lots of music, that kind of thing. But yet the Emergencies Measures Act was brought in and was invoked. Was there ever at any point any evidence given as to why such an extreme measure had to be taken?
In my opinion, no. So I went to have a look myself, and what I saw was people waving Canadian flags and dancing in the streets, and essentially it was a group of happy people, and I attributed to the fact that they had found each other and discovered that there were other people who thought like them. But there was no violence to be seen at any point that I'm aware of, and even the government itself, although it invoked the Emergencies Act on the grounds that there was a threat of serious violence. When the public safety minister was asked by a reporter, well, do you have intelligence of weapons or the like in the convoy? What's this based upon? The public safety minister essentially said, well, no, it's not that we have intelligence like that. It's the rhetoric. It's the rhetoric, an expression of a political ideology. Now, let's just pause for a moment and consider the implications of that. That means that the government has invoked an emergency statute on the basis of speech, an expression of a political ideology. That's an extraordinary thing. That means that the emergency was the ideological threat to the government's position. And if a government is able to invoke an emergency statute on that basis, then as a country, we are in a really dark place.
Oh, absolutely. When you just hearing you say those words and explain it so clearly, for a moment there, I thought, my gosh, that's something I would hear in communist Cuba or China. But in Canada, this is really where we're at?
Right. Exactly so. Exactly so. And note the relationship here between the idea of freedom of expression and violence. So here's one of the phenomenon that's going on right now. So we have a dominant political ideology that is redefining words. And there's a whole list of them they're redefining, racism, freedom, rule of law, take your pick. But one of those words is violence. And violence is being redefined so that it can include words. And they're taking that literally now. I mean, along the way during the convoy, it was said that the honking that the trucks were doing constituted violence. Now, this is a strange notion to those of us who are still relatively sane. But nevertheless, this is the notion that if you say things that are threatening to the prevailing ideology, you are guilty of violence. And this invocation seemed to take that literally, as in, you're a threat. You're a threat to the established order. And because you're a threat to the established order, therefore, we're going to declare an emergency and get you out.
But this is absurd. Absurd. It's true and absurd. How does one then protest a policy, an issue? How does one peacefully demonstrate if they run an opinion counter to that of the norm or the government?
Well, right. It's a good question. And of course, there are people back on Parliament Hill now protesting. They're on their feet, they're waving flags, and they're not being arrested, which that's of course appropriate.
That's good.
And it's not that there was no unlawfulness at all with the convoy. Of course, they were double parked in the street, and clearly there were violations of parking bylaws and probably the Highway Traffic Act. So it's not like there was nothing to enforce. But for the most part, those infractions were not enforced. Instead, we went from 0 to 100 all in a flash. And it was a determination, or appeared to be a determination on the part of the government, to cast this not as common people who had come to object to a policy that infringed their freedom, but as a fringe group whose views were not to be tolerated, but instead to be demonized and to be characterized or caricatured as people who were up to no good, and who posed the risk of some kind of violence. And in fact, after the fact, even the public safety minister more or less doubled down and said that there was, a threat of rape.
Right.
And there was no real evidentiary ground for that at all.
Welcome back. We're discussing the status and health of Canada's democracy and our civil liberties and our free speech. And joining me is Professor Bruce Pardee, Director of Rights Probe and a Professor of Law at Queen's University. Professor Pardy, we left off just before we went to commercial break where, the definition of violence, or what some were suggesting was violent at this convoy, what was happening, what violations were happening. And you brought up rape. Was there raping at the protest?
Well, this is the government flailing for a reason to justify what they've done. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's no concrete evidence of anything like that at all. And even the public safety minister didn't say that actually occurred. It was sort of like the insidious kind of accusation about rhetoric that he'd made earlier, which is, somebody somewhere said that there might have been a risk of this happening at some point from someone, as though it was a real thing.
Wow.
But as I say, the impression that I have is that this is simply a government official, looking for a justification for something that's already been done, because there isn't actually any concrete evidence of a problem.
This is absurdistan. Let's talk about the seizing of assets. So, whether you were in favor or opposed to the trucker convoy, whether you had an opinion on vaccine mandates or mask mandates or any mandate for that matter, the world sort of took notice when the Canadian government gave itself the ability to seize and freeze bank accounts. And I think Bay Street, the Canadian banking system, really shot up and said, hold on a second, what exactly are we doing here? I know for me, my husband, especially because he worked in banking, it was shocking. This was like a demarcation point that we never thought we would cross this line, but we did.
Yes.
What does that mean for our civil liberties, especially when it comes to our faith in the banking system? Yes.
This really is an inflection point for this country. This was both a dark moment and a moment of hope, for the reasons we alluded to earlier. But the dark side of this is we crossed some kind of a line here. And the line was, you know what? The government's just going to come in and freeze your assets if it doesn't like what you're doing. Because that's really all it was. They invoked the Emergencies Act, passed a couple of regulations, one of which gave the banks both the power and the responsibility to freeze accounts of people who were involved in the protest, and
or who simply donated, or even someone who donated to the protest.
Right, and of course, according to the official statements, it was not intended to catch people who had really donated, but there were lots of reports that was actually happening, and the banks, on the one hand, didn't object off the top, at least publicly, but and went ahead and did these things, but on the other, it sounds like they were alarmed by the implications, and they should be, because this really is a threat to the stability of the financial system, the reputation of the country as a free place, a democratic place, a place where your financial assets won't be seized on a whim, as might be the case in some third world country that we've heard about through history. Bad move, bad call, bad news all around. This is not what we want to see in our country. And unless there is pushback now to say this is not appropriate, this is overreach, you should not be entitled to do this kind of thing, then we'll be stuck with the consequences of this move, and nobody realistically should be assured that this will not happen again.
But is it too late to regain that confidence? I mean, once again, this line has been crossed. How does a Canadian have, or how should they have confidence in the banking system when a law could be passed on a whim, suggestively without any evidence, that could see their accounts frozen? Again, akin to something you would see in a developing nation or one run by a dictator.
Well, realistically, they probably shouldn't. Because along with the actual regulation, the government has made lots of noises during this short period that this is sort of the long-term plan. You know, that this goes along with regulating these crowdfunding platforms, including their use of Bitcoin. It includes all the noises that we've heard about putting in a digital currency and a digital ID and a social credit system. And all these things are proceeding apace and, in fact, may have been given a boost during this period. It's sort of a trial run to see how far they could go and how much pushback they would get. There's no reason at all to have any confidence in the back to normal, because we're not back to normal. The COVID experience has destroyed the normal, and the new normal that is arising is not a new normal that anybody should want to live in. This is our moment of truth, in a sense, in this country, to see if we can get our free country back.
Welcome back. So what is the new normal after the Emergencies Act? What is our new normal after seeing many areas of society have free speech quashed, essentially? Professor Pardy, you know, traditionally, or I guess in the recent past, usually we find the censorship coming from within the academia, that it's academics, you know, perhaps like yourself, who are being censored. But lately with COVID, we've seen that it's been actually medical professionals who've had actions taken to censor them. I recall Ontario's Health Minister, Christine Elliott, declaring that she asked and ordered the licensing body of the Ontario doctors to go after and review those licenses of doctors that were accused of spreading misinformation. Great word, misinformation. What does it mean? So is that the threat of the, like, which sector of society is most vulnerable now for free speech? Is it the medical doctors?
At the moment, yes. Well, so misinformation is a word that essentially means censorship. Yes?
Yes.
Because, again, we're supposed to be living in a free society. And in a free society, you can say what you think. The test for free speech is not truth. You can say what you think, even if it's wrong. And if we get to the stage of thinking, well, you can't say anything that's not true, or not judged to be true by the authorities in question, well, then we're a long way off from where we think we are, right? So as a free citizen, the presumption shouldn't be that everything you hear is true, you know, on the news or on Twitter or from the government. The presumption should be the opposite. You should have skepticism about the truth of anything you hear. And as a free person, your job is to figure out what you think is right. Now, that's a lot of work, and people are lazy. And some people have gotten to the state of thinking that what they think should be true because the government has filtered out all the misinformation. But that means that misinformation is the same thing as censorship. And the College of Physicians and Surgeons has been telling their doctors not to say things that contradict the official narrative, which is a horrendous thing, because it means they're telling the doctors not to exercise their own or express their own medical opinions about the COVID state of affairs. That's an appalling state to be in. It means that the regulator has taken on the job of defining what is true and not true, as opposed to their proper job, which is to ensure competence, that people, the doctors have training and they understand, you know, medical practice and so on. But really, you're talking about a class of professionals, some of whom will have different opinions than the official narrative. And we need to hear those opinions in order for ourselves to be able to make a reasonable assessment of what is true and what is not true.
Yes, I feel that as an individual, I am no longer allowed or permitted to make these decisions for myself, that I need, you know, the government to tell me, or the chief medical officer of health to tell me what's safe, what isn't, that I need federal government to tell me what's a safe environment, what isn't, what is violence, what isn't, what is appropriate thought, what isn't.
Right.
I feel very suffocated.
This is all based upon a particular kind of ideology, one characteristic of which is this, that experts and officials are there to tell us what to think. and we must abide by what they tell us. And it is only the approved experts with the knowledge and understanding to be able to define what that is. And if
I feel like you and I are right now reviewing 1984 of the book, but no, we're talking about Canada.
That's exactly right. But this is how far we've gone. This is how dark a place we've arrived at. And that's how important the trucker thing is, because at least now there's a little life in the populace that says, well, hold on, wait a minute. We actually don't consent to this. We do not agree with the legitimacy of the system that we now appear to be in, because that system has changed. It's eroded. We don't have the kind of protections that we thought that we did. It doesn't work on the same kind of values that we thought we had, right. And we don't like it. And
this is the new normal?
This is the new normal. This is going to be the struggle for the next little while, and how it's going to turn out is anybody's guess.
My goodness. Well, again, it's been, whether you agree with the truckers or not, I think Canadians have to say that it's been great knowing that Canadians have found their voice. We found some level of patriotism. I see so many Canadian flags around. I always remember going south of the border and seeing so many American flags on mailboxes and things. And now Canada seems to have some patriotism. So that's a beautiful thing. And I don't think that's bad at all. But anyways, Professor Pardy, thank you so much for joining me today. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure, Tanya. Thanks.
So that was a heavy show when we discussed what the new normal will look like. It doesn't sound so great, does it? But again, you have a voice, you have a mind, use it. It's a good thing to do, because that's what democracy is about. It's about using your voice. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.